My name is Asieh Namdar, and I'm honored to be here to moderate this with our very distinguished group of panelists. We're going to get right into questions. A quick introduction. We have a limited amount of time, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. Your questions are also important. Almost a year ago, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the nuclear agreement.
The next one will probably, we probably will not renew waivers on civil nuclear cooperation, which was a big part of the JCPOA that allowed particularly the Chinese and Brits to cooperate with the Iranians on their civil nuclear program. And now that may not be allowed to go forward. That was a key benefit of the deal. So with each pressure point, we are making it impossible for the Iranians to even consider to come back to the table. I mean, that is a non-starter right now. If it is the fulfillment of Secretary Pompeo's 12 goals, well, the Iranians read the 12 goals as basically regime change. Because if you even a cursory read of them, and once you move forward with those, it really means changing everything about the government, the system, and so forth. So that's not acceptable either. And then it gets to flat out regime change. And I think at this stage of the game, the Iranians see U.S. policy at best flat out economic warfare against them, and at worst regime change, either by influence or eventually by force. And again, how do we measure success of policy? Well, in all of these cases, it has been an abject failure. And I do think that if indeed the goal was to get the Iranians back to the table, that's rather disingenuous, isn't it? Because as part of the JCPOA, there is a very important mechanism. It's called the Joint Commission that brought together senior officials from the U.S. and Iran together regularly to discuss issues. There already was a table to discuss these issues. And the way I look at it, and I'm going to be very blunt, the Obama administration actually teed up the Trump administration with a great big gift. And that was the JCPOA, for them then to build on it and address other issues that are problematic in our bilateral relationship, everything from missiles to the region and Syria and Yemen and Iraq and now Afghanistan. Let's add that to the mix. And I've just come to the conclusion that this administration didn't want to do that work. You know, it's so much easier to tear down agreements like the JCPOA, which took nearly 12 years to negotiate.
In fact, this administration has torn down many international.
Yes, and don't forget our European allies, our closest friends, worked on this for a decade in earnest before we even became involved. So it is much easier to tear things down than to build it up. So I really have to call BS on the whole notion of we got out of the Iran deal to get the Iranians back to the table. JCPOA, through the Joint Commission, provided a negotiating table. We're the ones who left it.
Jamal, overall endgame here for the United States.
So, endgame. Sometimes, assessing the policies of this administration feels like more of a Rorschach test than a policy analysis exercise. It depends who you talk to, and I think there's a lot of lack of clarity. Is Pompeo's 12 demands the policy? Does John Bolton have a different policy? Where does President Trump stand? And so the best that I've been able to piece together what the idea here is, it really is looking at what John Bolton has said publicly prior to taking his position with the administration, which, at the height of negotiations over the nuclear deal, John Bolton argued that to stop Iran's bomb, we need to bomb Iran. And his argument at the time was that either the U.S. or Israel, this is in the middle of the negotiations, this is 2015 when we were closing in on the JCPOA, that either the United States or Israel can undertake a limited bombing exercise, take out Iran's nuclear facilities, and then in the destruction, go all out in a regime change effort. I think that what we're doing here in talking about policies is we're trying to assign some reason to why these different steps are being taken, but I don't think it's very nuanced. I think it's pretty clear that the idea behind maximum pressure is get the Iranians to exit the nuclear deal. Because right now, what the Iranians have on their side is that the entire international community, save Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE, are on Iran's side of this issue, which is such a stark departure from where we were just a few years ago with what the Obama administration did. If Iran can be goaded to leave the nuclear deal, then I think you actually will see some of the things that John Bolton had been advocating for potentially come to fruition. And I think it's a big if, though, if Iran actually leaves the deal. Suzanne talks about this gift that the previous administration left Trump with, and I think that they did leave them with this gift, and instead of the Trump administration trying to build on these negotiations, they've actually pocketed the concessions that Iran made, which has given them some buffer time, where the nuclear issue is not a crisis. We're not in the middle of a crisis where people are talking about, enrichment levels and stockpiles and Netanyahu's claim to the bomb at the UN. They actually have this buffer period where they're able to try out this policy or this range of policies that are not actually working. And I think that the aim is to actually to end that so that the U.S. can move to a truly maximum pressure campaign, which either involves getting the international community involved in putting diplomatic pressure on Iran, or more likely, actually beginning to do some of the things John Bolton talked about, which does involve military intervention, whether it's on a small scale or a small scale.
Well, to be fair, let's talk about what the Trump administration has said. They're saying one of their main objectives is to change Iran's malign behavior. They're destabilizing activities in the region and to persuade act like a normal country. So has this really changed their malign activities and their destabilizing behavior, or is it simply making Iran, which of course is not without many issues and many faults, is it actually making the country stronger, especially among the hardliners?
I think the fatal flaw in the administration's policy is the failure to recognize that coercive sanctions cannot have the intended effect when the ultimate goal or objective is regime change and everything but name. For those of you who haven't read it, David Cohen, the former deputy director of the CIA and former Treasury sanctions official, had a really fantastic essay on this, where he made recently in Foreign Affairs, and he made the case that when the objective has existential implications for the target of sanctions, those sanctions are doomed to fail. The cost of enduring those sanctions is always going to be less than the alternative, and that is relinquishing power and regime change in some ways. So I think that their strategy suffers from that fatal flaw, and I think because of that, we haven't seen, insofar as I have been able to tell, any real change in Iran's behavior, either for better or for worse. For worse, I mean, the Iranians could have escalated in any number of ways. They could have actually moved to limit oil exports by closing the strait. They could have given the green light, or at least a yellow light, more of a yellow light, to militias in places like Iraq and Syria, especially following the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. At the same time, they have not, again, insofar as I have been able to tell, really responded to the sanctions in the way that the Trump administration purports that they were intended to. They have not relinquished their role in Yemen, in Syria. The Quds Force continues to be a destabilizing force. Hezbollah continues to be a destabilizing force throughout the region. So I think we've seen a pretty remarkable degree of resilience on the part of the Iranians, despite what the Trump administration has managed to throw their way in terms of sanctions that are supposed to be coercive.
And at some point, Iran would argue, we're going to run out of patience. We are not, our commitment to JCPOA is not forever. So do you believe, Suzanne, Iran is going to stick it out and stay committed to the terms of this agreement? And what do they have to gain by staying in?
Well, I think if you followed Foreign Minister Zarif last week, he made many public appearances, and this was the very question he put forward. He added a new twist to the mix. He said that there's a debate now in Iran, not only to pull out of the JCPOA, but also perhaps to pull out of the NPT, which could then plunge this into an actual crisis if they do that. I hope that they don't. I mean, there are several options before the Iranians right now. One is to just go ahead and resume a full-scale program, possibly withdraw from the NPT, as I just said. I think this is a very unlikely scenario because for the first time, I think, in a very long time, or even ever, on this one issue, they actually have a moral high ground. They actually have the support of the world, except for a handful of countries.
What about
Politically,
economic benefits?
the economic benefits, I think if they're thinking to 2020, which is a year and 7 months away, that they might be able to manage that. It would be very difficult to do. If there was a second Trump term, then that might change the calculus. And we'll have to see how 2020 goes. But I think for now, they've come to the conclusion that they're going to play for a little time. They're probably going to continue to comply with the deal. I think one of the things they may do is start pushing the envelope on things. So for example, if the IAEA requests to see a site, they may drag their feet a little. They may bring up their stockpile of enriched uranium, not over the top of the requirements, but just brushing up against it. So I think they're going to start flexing their muscle, but I think right now, the political benefits they're deriving from staying in the deal are quite large. And let's face it, if they get out of the JCPOA and get out of the NPT to boot, they then will become an isolated party, not us. It'll switch the tables. And I think they would want to do that.
Jamal, let me move on to European trade and investment in Iran. And Suzanne was talking about Medellin. A group of us reporters last week, and when someone asked a question about investment, he said, very honest, it's lukewarm at best. But there's this new channel called INSTEX, Instrument in Support of Trade Exchanges, set up by France, Britain, and Germany. Can this actually work in setting up some kind of financial transactions so Iran can benefit and those countries will not be punished by the United States?
It may be premature, but I think that the INSEX mechanism so far has been pretty disappointing. It's not online yet. I think it was perhaps a bold political statement that Europe is defying U.S. sanctions by setting up this mechanism. But the reality is the mechanism is actually for permissible humanitarian trade. So we're not even talking about the trade that was supposed to be permissible under the nuclear deal. We're talking about trade that under U.S. law is actually permitted, and there are not enough financial channels for that trade to actually happen. So Iran just had massive floods over the past several weeks, and I know at NIAC we are fielding calls from NGOs, charities in the United States, people who want to be able to donate to the relief efforts, and even though those are supposed to be exempt from sanctions, the channels don't exist to make that happen. So in theory, maybe INSEX, because Europe put prominent European leaders in charge of that, who would then have to be sanctioned by the United States if the Trump administration were to react. They've made a political statement. Practically, I don't think it makes a difference, and I think this actually strikes to really what's happening here and what Europe needs to consider, which is that as much as Trump wants, or people around Trump maybe want regime change in Iran, we already have regime change in the United States, and this may be permanent. When Pompeo talks about Iran behaving as a normal country, well, the United States is not operating as a normal country, and typically the United States derived its power from the international order and the notion that diplomacy works. If we say we're going to do something and we commit to it, we're actually going to do it. We're now the ones in violation of that, not just with Iran, but all these other areas. And for Europe, I think what they are having to decide now is this the new reality? Is Trumpism how the United States is actually operating? And does Europe need to take stronger steps to assert its sovereignty and to not allow this to become the norm where they are still relying on the United States as an ally that the United States was for so many decades? Or do they need to take these new efforts? And I think that that's really what's being tested. I think that if Trump makes it past 2020, this will really come to a head. But for now, The only thing that we're seeing happening is that Trump has begun to institutionalize that diplomacy with Iran is off the table, that it cannot work, that Europe and others cannot do business with Iran. And I think that the major challenge for Europe, as well as the United States, as well as people in this room, is how do you ensure that this regime change is not permanent in the United States, and that the United States returns to being the responsible actor that the U.S. derives so much influence and power from for so many years.
Here's another question for all of you. Diplomacy with Iran, the way the Trump administration sees it, out of the question. But with North Korea, oh, all kinds of possibilities. And I just want to delve a little deeper into why this humongous difference with how they approach in each country. And I believe the threat from North Korea, some might argue, is even more than from Iran.
Well, it's what they're laying down is a very perverse set of incentives. I mean, they're sending the message that we will talk to you only as long as you have a nuclear weapon. And so these multiple summits with Kim Jong-un, I think, don't help to bolster the non-proliferation norm, and in fact, they actually undermine it in that respect. But I think what we're seeing here is the fact that Iran policy is not, in my estimation, primarily driven by President Trump. He's sort of an empty vessel when it comes to this. And those around him, those who care most about this, namely John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, they are, I think, willing to entertain Trump when it comes to North Korea. If Trump wants to sit with Kim Jong-un and have show this pageantry to the world and have the photo op that will captivate our national attention for a few days, I think they're fine letting that happen. I don't think they are optimistic or sanguine about the prospects for any real breakthrough there. But Iran is a real red line for them. It was before they were in the administration, and it certainly is now. And I think that, I think it was the Dexter Filkins profile of John Bolton that just came out in the New Yorker. There was a really interesting anecdote. On the sidelines of the first UN General Assembly, Trump, the report goes, tried to broker a back-channel meeting with President Rouhani at the General Assembly. He tried to do so through French President Macron. The next year, when John Bolton was then by his side as National Security Advisor, Macron reportedly came up to Trump and said, "Hey, do you want me to pass a message this year?" And Trump's response was, "No, the Iranians need to suffer a little." So clearly, he is being driven and I think filled with the ideological zeal of those around him, and those around him care intently about Iran, and they're happy to go along with whatever Trump wants to do with Korea.
You brought up Iranian suffering, and I want to talk a little bit more about how these economic sanctions have really affected ordinary Iranians. Trump administration said this is the fault of the Iranian government. There were also calls for mismanagement, corruption, infrastructure issues, and floods. They are to blame for the suffering of Iranian people. And the Trump administration, especially Secretary Pompeo, time after time has said, please support the aspirations and hopes of Iranian people.
Well, a lot of the suffering in Iran is because of the Iranian government. I think you ask any Iranian, they're going to tell you. There are very few who are happy with the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic is currently constituted. What the United States has done has been to actually give the Islamic Republic a pretty compelling narrative about how it's actually the United States who is to blame for this. And, really, probably is going to leave them off the hook. I think what we're seeing inside of Iran is, at least among the political class, a real consolidation around a more hardline position. We have to remember that, I think the narrative that we're seeing in the United States right now is, you hear Pompeo and other officials repeat this constantly, that there are no moderates and reformers and hardliners inside of Iran. It's all the same. If you're with the Iranian government, if you're inside of Iran, you are a monolith. And this seems to be a really important talking point for them, because when we got the nuclear deal, part of it was an understanding that there's actually politics inside of Iran. And in 2013, when Hassan Rouhani was elected, we had millions of Iranians turn out to actually deliver this mandate for a new president who was campaigning on the notion of engaging with the United States and saying, you know, the Ahmadinejad policies of resistance and provocation has not worked, and the way that we actually can improve our economic lot and for Iran to join its, you know, its rightful position in the world is through actual engagement and moderation in policies. And what Trump has done, and what the Trump administration has done, is, you know, unequivocally said, no way. Talking to the United States has no upside, because you're gonna stick your neck out politically, you're gonna make all these concessions, and then we're gonna pull the rug out from under you. And so now you have the Rouhanis and the Zarifs inside of Iran who are having to kind of toe this line of, yeah, engaging the United States actually wasn't such a good deal. What I think that then does is, you know, if you look at what Pompeo says that he wants from the United States, it makes the notion of further concessions from Iran impossible. You know, how do you get the Iranians to decide they're going to limit or eliminate their ballistic missile program? They're going to cut off support for Hezbollah and other groups in the region and terrorist groups. How do you convince them to do that if Iran does not believe that they can actually secure commensurate concessions from the United States? So they've taken that off the table, and then you know what I think is happening as far as the aspirations of the House of Representatives. For the one with the aspirations of the I don't think you can understate how important Iran's independence and sovereignty is to Iranians. Even Iranians who hate the regime, even Iranians who support taking out the regime, independence has been at the center of the Iranian national narrative for decades. And you can't just, thank you, you can't just wipe that off of the map. You know, you can't wipe that equation off the map. And I think what we are going to see is, as the United States pressure increases, as the notion of the United States as this savior of the Iranian people it is juxtaposed with the fact that the United States has a Muslim ban that bans all Iranians from coming to the United States, did not lift a finger around the flood relief. As that suffering grows, I think that the Iranian government has the perfect cover to say this is all the United States' fault.
So Suzanne, do you think the White House strategy is actually prompting the Iranian population, usually very critical of their government, to rally behind their government?
I actually think the policy we're pursuing is completely self-defeating. With the JCPOA, it gave the Iranian government incentive, some may even say the cover, is to pursue reforms, banking reforms, meeting the standards of Fatah, other things like that. That now the motivation for doing that is completely gone. So it was a way for more moderate politicians to actually attack corruption. Now those politicians don't stand a chance if they want to pursue those kinds of policies. And let me just inject a personal anecdote. You know, I've had the occasions to travel to the region and make a number of visits to Iran over the years. And I have to say, one of the things I admired, especially about the people of Iran, is the level of sophistication where they are able to differentiate between the people of America and the government of America. And I've always appreciated that. And when you travel to Iran as an American, you've heard these stories before, I personally have felt it. You're walking down the street, someone says, why don't you come to my house for dinner? You've never met them before. I'm from New York. Someone said that to me. I say, get the hell out of here. But I'm in Iran, so I say, of course I'm going to come to your house and I'm going to have the time of my life. So to get to this point is what we are doing now. In one country in the region where we actually have the hearts and minds of the people on the street, we are destroying that. We are forcing them to really back their government now in every way, shape, and form. And that is so self-defeating. Let me just say a quick word about North Korea, because I want to remind you, just a couple of months ago, Secretary Pompeo, you might remember, was being interviewed by the press, a reporter, I forget who it was, and she asked him, Mr. Secretary, you know, it's very puzzling, you're talking to North Koreans at a high level, but not to the Iranians. Can you explain why? And he came out and said, well, have nuclear weapons. So of course the signal to Pyongyang is you better keep those nuclear weapons, otherwise we're not going to talk to you. And of course the message to the Iranians was you better get them fast. So what I think we've done by withdrawing from the JCPOA, we have actually sent a message to the North Koreans that I think lessened the chances of us reaching any deal with them.
Word doesn't matter.
Word doesn't matter, but you know, at the heart of the JCPOA was a very simple bargain. You cut off the pathways to a nuclear bomb, and we lift sanctions. Well, we've reneged on that now. Guess what the North Koreans want? They also want lifting of sanctions, and they're taking a very bad lesson from this experience, that even if you comply with every commitment put forward to you, we still, on a whim, could decide, hey, we're not going to lift those sanctions. The crown jewel of the JCPOA is the inspection system that it involves. And you know, I think we should have stayed with the deal, held it up to the North Koreans and say, look, at the very heart of this deal is a most robust, extensive monitoring inspection regime ever negotiated. And that should have been a model for whatever deal we reach with the North Koreans.
I have one final question to all of you, and then I want to open the floor to questions. Looking ahead to 2020 U.S. elections, will Iran be a major issue? Will the Democratic candidates have already said, many of them, that they want to put the United States back in the JCPOA? And apparently Israel has already voiced concerns saying that would be unacceptable. So a quick note from all of you about the elections and what Javad Zarif, Iran's foreign minister, has called the B team's influence. And by B team, in case you don't know, he's talking about John Bolton, bin Salman, and the UAE. No, I'm gonna forget that, exactly. So let's begin with you, Ned.
So I think my sense and my hope is that during the Democratic primaries, that Iran won't be a divisive issue, because I think we're seeing an emerging consensus, and that is upon assumption of office to re-enter the deal. And many have made the point, the wise point, I think, that the deal, the solution needs to be additive, not destructive, and that you take the JCPOA as the baseline, you work diplomatically with our partners in this, in the P5+1, with Iran, to negotiate other deals as they pertain to ballistic missiles and other points of contention between the U.S. And Iran. And I think it's not just many, it's most Democratic candidates have come out in favor of some sort of formula like this. Harris, Buttigieg, Biden, Sanders, Warren, O'Rourke, Inslee, Moulton, Castro, Gabbard, Nessam, Williamson.
But here's my question: if Israel, United States' closest ally in the Middle East, has a problem with that, would that change the equation for all those people?
Well, the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu has not been shy about injecting itself into our domestic politics. It has also not been shy about allowing President Trump to inject himself into their domestic politics. You need only look at the billboard of Netanyahu and Trump that was hanging just outside Tel Aviv, and Trump's gift to Netanyahu of the Golan Heights just before the elections. What I guess it was last month now. So yes, I think there will be. I think we will be hearing quite a bit from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, as we recall, in 2015 actually came to our Congress, unbeknownst, at least initially.
Was that with the show and tell diagram?
No, that was at the UN. That was as the JCPOA was coming together. He came to the Congress at the invitation of the Republican speaker behind the back of the Obama administration, and made a highly partisan address before our Congress, lobbying our Congress not to go along with this deal. So yes, I think Netanyahu will seek to pay back President Trump for the political gifts that he gave him, and his opposition to the deal is wrong-headed, but I think it's heartfelt, and I think he will be aggressive in making that case in our political system.
Jamal, and then finally Suzanne.
Well, look, I will not engage in any politicking in the government office, but let me just, for the 2020 Democratic candidates, the Benjamin Netanyahu primary is over. Trump has won. do not try to make that the centerpiece of your campaign. Netanyahu opposed the deal the first time, he'll oppose it the second time. We know this. I think that in 2020, it's actually starts to see a cost, and which would be very bad. If Iran begins to tinker with the details of the deal, begins to actually ratchet up some of that pressure that was being felt in 2013 when we actually decided we needed to go to the table and get a deal, because otherwise Iran was going to be on the brink of having an undetectable breakout capability. If Iran begins to do those types of escalations, I think this will be an issue, and I think it'll be a question of, okay, was Trump right all along because Iran is now violating the agreement, or did Trump screw up big time because now Iran is violating the agreement that they had been adhering to for so long? I think the other way that it becomes an issue is if this election is about the United States, and what is the United States a normal country? Do we, behave normally internationally? Do we derive our influence through partnerships rather than bullying? And so if this is about returning to some of the norms that the United States used to embrace, then I think the Iran deal, just like some of the other issues like the Paris Climate Accord and some of the other deals, I think that will be at the center of these elections. Right now in Washington, there's this debate about, do we return to the Iran nuclear deal? And you have, NIAC came out and said, yes, the 2021 candidate, whoever wins in 2021 should commit on the first day, we're going to return to our commitments. And then you have others who are saying, no, we need more, we need a bigger deal. And then you have, the sort of Trump and Bolton folks who are saying, no, we no deal. I think this is a little bit of a false debate, because it may not be up to the United States whether we can rejoin the deal. Will Iran have us back at the table, at the Joint Commission?
Might be too late at that point.
Will they have us back? I think what this actually needs to be about is, will the United States embrace its commitments? Will we return to our commitments? And then we can seek to re-enter the deal. We can seek to potentially try to negotiate a larger deal. But that negotiation is never going to happen if the first deal that took 15 years to negotiate is collapsed because of U.S. violations. So first things first, we need to just go back to our commitments. Then we can start to talk about what more we want to see from Iran and try to get them to the table to actually talk about those things.
Suzanne?
Well, I actually think one of the ways candidates should frame this issue is in terms of rebuilding our relationships with our allies that have been so badly damaged, not only because of this issue, but so many others. And I think returning to the deal without preconditions is one way to do that. The Paris Climate Agreement was also mentioned. There are a lot of other ways we can rebuild the bridges with the allies. I think that has to be a priority for any candidate, and certainly this is one way to do it. The other thing is, when I think about the road ahead, for the Democratic candidates, unfortunately, foreign policy is never a big part of presidential campaign. We usually get a little slice of the debate stage on foreign policy issues. But I do think the Iran deal is going to be included as part of an all-around litmus test, because it is such a it represents such a big part of the Trump administration's foreign policy failures. So I do think it's very encouraging. I think now 10 out of 20 candidates, maybe more now, have said they would come back to the deal. I think also the resolution passed by the Democratic National Committee to include reentering the deal as part of the platform is also quite popular and positive. So I think that the Iran deal is going to be, like I said, a litmus test question for candidates. And it's very encouraging that all of them have come forward already to stake this out. The one thing I would say is now as we're approaching campaign season, well, not approaching, we're in it, I would really like to see Congress and the Senate start holding hearings, assessing this administration's Iran policy, calling senior officials in to give their assessment of where they're at and where they're going, and calling experts in to give their assessments as well. I think that we need some oversight on this. One of the things, a couple of months ago, John Bolton a report in the New York Times, I believe, revealed that John Bolton asked the Pentagon for military options on striking Iran. You know, I know this happens normally in every administration, but the fact that he did it at this time really alarmed me. So I do think hearings are in order.
All right, Suzanne, DiMaggio, Jamal, Abdi, advice, thank you so much. We're gonna open the vote. Mega.
I have a question.
Just following up on what Suzanne was saying, let's think worst case scenario. What are the prospects for war? Because I know a lot of people are comparing this to the pre-Iraq era, and in some ways it's similar. John Bolton is back in office, but in some ways it's also different. Zarif, last week in New York, he kept talking about accidents, not a full-on war, but accidents, the possibility of accidents happening. What do you think are the prospects, all of you? And also about the prisoner swap. I mean, that was kind of a surprise proposal, although it's apparently been on the table. What do you think the administration's final response to that is going to be? Are they going to take it? Is that going to be a breakthrough? Maybe this one would be for Suzanne, because you've done track two.
Okay, on the issue of the planned accident, I think at this stage of the game, a military strike by design by the U.S. towards Iran is unlikely. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but I think it's unlikely. What concerns me more is miscalculation. And now that we have designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and of course the Iranians retaliated by designating CENTCOM now as a foreign terrorist organization, that heightens the hostilities in an already tumultuous region where our troops and Iranian troops and proxies are increasingly butt up against each other, whether it's in Syria or Iraq. So the idea of an accident or miscalculation worries me, and what adds to that concern is the lack of official communication channels. Now that we're out of the JCPOA, that channel is gone. When Zarif and Kerry had each other's phone numbers and could, when our sailors strayed into the Iranian waters, they were able to resolve that before it escalated into a conflict. No such channel exists right now. And in fact, I asked Zarif last week, do you have any phone numbers of any senior officials? And he said no. So that should concern us. Now, the point about the prisoners, what was interesting about what Zarif said was that he put this offer to negotiate an exchange well over 6 months ago to the U.S. And it was in response to a U.S. request for that that happened last year. So I'm hoping now we're at the stage, and I'm glad that he went public with it, because I think we should know about this. We really have to ask, why is our government not acting on that? Why isn't it making it a priority? I think, yes, they would probably respond because we're in maximum pressure mode. It's all pressure all the time. But I would insist that something like prisoners is a humanitarian issue. It should be kept separate from political dialogue. This is how diplomacy works, and we shouldn't get confused that this is a sign of weakness that we are asking the Iranians to come to the table. This is a humanitarian dialogue on the exchange of prisoners, and we should move forward with it without delay.
Other questions? Yes.
Hi. My question is related to, actually, let's assume that the Democrats are going to take over in 2020. So my question is related to the scope of the return to status quo ante, in the sense that the U.S. left the JCPOA, but in the meantime, the U.S. has also added a whole host of other restrictions and things like that on its relationship with the U.S., with Iran. So there are a lot of new individuals and organizations. There's the Muslim ban and stuff like that. So is anybody keeping track of the laundry list of things that have been initiated since Trump took over. And when we go back to status quo ante, how much of this is gonna be included? And are we talking about a clean slate, get rid of everything, or some of it, or this and that? I mean, it's gonna be a complicated process if you really think about it in those terms.
So I think you're hitting on something that I think is very important. I think beyond just violating the deal and unilaterally abandoning it, I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is to make it impossible, or next to impossible, for a future Democratic administration to reenter it. And I think the clearest example of that was the designation of the IRGC last week. I think their assessment was that yes, it was part and parcel of their maximum pressure campaign. It would actually convey criminal penalties for anyone who does business with the IRGC, which does touch a large portion of the Iranian economy. But I think there was also a calculation there that a Democrat in 2021 will pay a political price for delisting the IRGC. I don't think that political price will be too high. I think if Donald Trump has taught us one thing, it's that you can do a lot, especially in the realm of foreign policy, as long as you explain yourself. And so I think I think the Democrat in 2021 will be able to get over that hurdle. I think when it comes to the Muslim ban, other designations, I think that would be something that a Democratic president would gleefully undo, certainly the Muslim ban. And I think by re-entering the Iran deal, we would be required to delist some of the entities that were designated subsequent to our abandonment of the Iran deal. So I don't see those as insurmountable obstacles, but I do think the Trump administration will try to erect some more hurdles as 2020 and 2021 get closer.
Other questions? Go ahead, sir. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you for this great panel tonight. My name is Vincent Lafaso. I've heard throughout this panel this notion called regime change, how it's probably replaced the word change with a collapse. And I feel like the administration here is trying to collapse or weaken Iran politically, militarily, and economically to the point where it doesn't pose a challenge to American dominance in the region, given that the region is losing its strategic significance. And the Jcpoa was a landmark agreement where we had a creative way to deal with a foe, given that we've had horrendous relations for 40 years.
And what your question is?
And, well, my question is, how far is the administration going to go with this maximum pressure campaign? Or can we go back to the Obama approach of sharing the region?
Well, going back to the Obama approach of sharing the region, I think is exactly what is being discussed. Is it being institutionalized that we cannot go back to that? This notion of is it regime collapse or regime change, or does the administration even care about the difference? I think is an open question. For regime change, who are the actors that are going to fill the void of, a new revolutionary state inside Iran? MEK, the Crown Prince. There is not actually a well-organized opposition to actually fill that void. There are well-organized entities inside of Iran, like the IRGC, who can fill that void. So I think the notion that they're going to actually see a regime change that doesn't actually look like collapse, where you have a jockeying among these entities for who's going to fill that void. I think that's really what we're talking about. And the pushback on collapse would be how devastating that could potentially be for the region, how destabilizing it could potentially be. What do you do with a failed state over there that has so many opportunities to mess things up in the region? And I think, that's why I wonder if this has actually been thought out. It feels like a Bin Salman strategy of just throw something at the wall and see if it sticks. So yeah, if they collapse or they change, it doesn't matter. The whole point is to put Iran on its back heel so that know, it's sort of like what the Saudis accuse Iran of doing in Yemen, of just creating this headache. It's like they want to do the same thing to Iran and do that within Iran's borders. And so I think that is very much in the discussion. So if they want regime change, I think they probably will have to settle for regime collapse. And I think ultimately the idea is that through some combination of an economic collapse and then potential, you know, mowing the lawn by bombing nuclear facilities or something like that, you create so much chaos, and then you wait to see who fills that void. And I don't think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be positive. Whoever does step up to do that, because the legitimate, you know, forces inside Iran who want democracy or who want reform, who want to actually change the system through the political mechanisms available to them, have been so weakened by this administration that you don't really see that group being able to actually step up and fill that void. And that's pertinent not just because of US policy, but because of where Iran may be going. If the supreme leader dies tomorrow, who's going to be equipped to actually, within the political system, shape where Iran goes, whether it has another Valayati Fahi, whether it has a council of these people, whether it becomes an all-out military dictatorship, whether it becomes something that looks more moderate and akin to what, you know, Rouhani and others have been arguing. I think right now, those forces that would be able to push it in a more moderate direction have just been completely undercut. And that is really potentially the biggest tragedy of this policy that the administration has undertaken.
I think we have time for one more question. This side of the room? No one? Anyone else on this side? Oh, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm not in politics. I'm in political, medical, cancer sciences. But there are a lot of parallels that we create false flag for the excuse of going to war. And my question is, who is actually benefiting from these myths that are needed to go to war, or as we call it, Jang Zargari? Who is actually benefit from these creating war? Because Iran,
You mean like a false narrative is what you're saying?
false flags, false narratives. And who is benefiting so far by Trump administration? I have to admit that as a Democrat, I voted for Trump because I thought he is a builder, not a destroyer. But it seems that he's destroying the fabric of not only morality in America, but also he's creating more, and he's supporting more of dictators, unfortunately including the dictators in Iran, not just in North Korea, by what he's doing to the Iranian.
I think I understand your question. So I think the false narrative, you're saying, who does it help? I think, I don't know if you guys agree with me, it certainly helps Saudi Arabia. It helps Israel. I mean, you guys chime in. I mean,
I would say it helps Iran's enemies, adversaries in the region, first and foremost. I mean, I myself do not think President Trump is pro-war with Iran. I think he actually doesn't want to see another conflict, U.S.-led conflict in the Middle East. I think he's being truthful about that, believe it or not. But I do think, as it was mentioned before, certain people around him would like to see us move in that direction. And the problem with President Trump, we saw it in Hanoi when he met with the North Koreans, is he doesn't know the issues. He doesn't know the content, he doesn't know the context, he doesn't know the history. So like when he was at the table with Kim Jong-un, he wasn't really able to negotiate because he doesn't know all these things. I think the same is true with Iran. I doubt he knows very much about Iran. I doubt he knows very much about our history with each other. And I doubt he probably has ever read the JCPOA. So I think that gives people who have agendas around him a lot of influence to steer us in that direction. And that's why this is such a worrying moment.
I'll let you guys have the final say, and then we're going to wrap it up.
I would just add one quick thing there. What I'm watching out for, and a red flag that I've seen, is talk of authorities from people like Mike Pompeo. He was asked about the potential for military conflict a couple weeks ago by a reporter, and he said then that President Trump will act very lawfully. He will act within his authorities. Article 2 gives broad powers to AUMF, the authorization for the use of military force, gives a set of broad powers, but we understand them. And so the fact that he cited Article 2, he cited the AUMF when asked an open-ended, expansive question about military conflict with Iran leads me to believe he's thinking about that. But also, I would add, is that as CIA director, Mike Pompeo declassified a bunch of files that were captured from bin Laden's compound. I was at CIA at the time when we started to declassify this. I was at the White House when we thought we had ended that process, putting out everything we thought at the time could be declassified. Mike Pompeo found additional files. In those files, there was a lot dealing with the interaction between Al-Qaeda and Iran. He has been very zealous in trying to paint a relationship there, and I think this gets to the AUMF question. So it gives me great concern when I hear him talk about these potential authorities, because I think people like Pompeo and Bolton are looking for ways to have them apply where they otherwise probably would not.
We could be in the middle of a crisis at any time on this issue, and as I said before, the fact that Iran is adhering to this agreement is our greatest protection against that crisis from happening. And preserving this deal is, I think, the greatest protection from having that crisis come to fruition. When the deal was struck in the face of political opposition here in the United States, with President Obama expending so much political capital behind that, the opponents of the deal immediately shifted to, we need to tear up the deal. And this became the rallying cry in the GOP primaries in 2016. And as a result, even though they were not making policy, they sent a message to the rest of the world that the Iran deal was not set in stone, that it may actually be overturned. And what that did was signal to the rest of the world and the banks and the companies to not invest in Iran just yet. So Iran actually never saw the full benefit of this agreement as the world waited to see who would become the next president and whether the deal would actually survive. Right now, even though we're not in the middle of a crisis necessarily with Iran, the legwork is being done by the administration. They're talking about the 2001 AUMF and Iran's supposed ties to Al-Qaeda as potential justification for military action. They're systematically institutionalizing the sanctions and the FTO designations, institutionalizing the enmity between the United States and Iran. All of this is happening, and I think what people who are within the political system, what they need to be doing right now is signaling very clearly this is an aberration. All of this work cannot be allowed to stand. We cannot compromise with Donald Trump's view or John Bolton's view on these things. We need to go back to our commitments. We need to pledge that we will go back to our commitments in 2021, and then we need to hope and pray that the Iranians don't decide to leave this deal so that we are in the middle of a